Thank you for coming to the fourth and final element in the program of talks which have taken place throughout the Ruy Rosen exhibition and which have had a relationship to it, which I've described for those of you who weren't here before as one of expanding the field in which we can look at Rosen's work rather than simply addressing ourselves to it and deciphering it as something which just belongs to itself or belongs to perhaps an over-predictable political field of the problems of the Middle East, and try and think about what makes Rosen's language and his particular political and aesthetic languages possible. And both in the long term, we've been going back to the 60s and the 70s, and also in terms of contemporary culture. Today is the final session, as I've said, and it's something of a self-indulgence for me. It's one which I've very specifically chosen. It's self-indulgence, first of all, because I have the chance of having David Dibosa here to discuss this film, and David is an important critic in the areas which I want to raise. He teaches at Chelsea, well, at the University of the Arts, Chelsea bit. And and you know, I'm sorry, I'm stuck in the old categories as far as I'm concerned. He teaches somewhere on the King's Road, where it no longer is. But, you know,
this is going to be a theme, I think.
And the second indulgence is that this film, Death, Baby or Santa Claus, which you're going to see in its entirety, is one in which you will hear my 23-year-old voice over on a number of occasions, sounding as if it had been brought in by the meter from Harrods, I'm afraid. But I think that's why Frankie wanted to use my voice at that moment in that film. And it's a film which was, as one would have said then, it was a trip making it. But at the same time, I think it's kind of quite an important movie, because it's the first movie that I know of, and scholars of black cinema and British cinema, and they say that I'm completely wrong. It's the first film that I know of that attempts, within the framework of a political movement, a Black Power movement, that followed on 10 years after the Notting Hill riots, that attempted to imagine a kind of complex first person, a kind of inner voice of what a black filmmaker might be in Britain at that moment. Even though there isn't a single voiceover or a single hero, or the hero's voice is not the voiceover all the time, and there is a hero, nonetheless, it's the first attempt to do that. I think the early 1950s saw the first British film with a black lead actor, which was Pool of London, and there were a number of films in the years after the riots that engaged with the problem of racism and the police. And if you look at now something like Sapphire or Flaming Streets with John Mills, you see the extent to which the agonizing over what happened last year in the London riots has been thought over for a very long time. There's nothing much new there, and the tensions of making a black presence in British cinema and who was going to make it were very important ones over a number of years. And Frankie's film, which was made in 1968 to 69, vanished very quickly. By 1971 or 72, it was gone. And I myself, as I came to know the younger generation of scholars of West Indian or African origin in Britain, like John Akamfra or Kobina Mercer, said to them that or Kojo Eshin, that one should look for this movie. It's a very important moment that I recall, and one from a moment of immense difficulty, although it's a lot of fun. It's also the moment of the Arts Lab in London. It's the moment when Helio Otisika was meeting Guy Brett and Paul Overin, beginning to produce an impact in the London art world. So it belongs to a very complex and rich moment of London artistic production, and has this characteristic of which I was speaking, and raises for me in relation to Rosen's show really quite an important issue, not of who is speaking for whom, but what is being spoken within what. What is being spoken within these characters. Not do you speak for someone, do you speak on behalf of someone, do you ventriloquize someone, but inside a frame, what is being spoken, and how is it possible for it to be spoken? And that, in a way, is the relationship which I want to set up with Rosen's downstairs exhibition, as well as the video upstairs, which some of you will have seen, with the very complex projections of voices into different characters, saying different things in such a way as to produce significance. No, I don't say significance. I want to use Julia Krestover's word of signifiance, of significance with the C missing, this kind of sense of a meaning coming through and dividing the way in which we see the world. So I think of Frankie as being still quite a unique voice in British cinema. And I want to show you a short extract from the film which was made him temporarily famous at the time that he was thinking of making this movie, and which in a way also brought us together. And he is one of the group of black people in Godard's Sympathy for the Devil, 1+1. Any of you who know the history of Godard's film will know that it had two names. One version was Sympathy for the Devil, which was chosen by Ian Quarrier, the producer, whom Godard hit on the nose at the premiere, rightly, I think, and then produced his own version called 1+1. And you can still get both these versions, but Quarrier's was rather a rather opportunistic version which valorized the Rolling Stones, and Godard wanted to valorize Godard actually rather than the Rolling Stones. And so, and so Enya hit Ian Quarrier on the nose and distributed a different version. In the BFI, people don't do that anymore. And Frankie is one of the Black Power people in this film, sitting in the junkyard. And I want you to look at a very, very short extract from the film before we look at Death May Be Your Santa Claus, because I think that it gives you some idea of what was possible or what wasn't possible in an avant-garde art culture for an aspiring black actor, a person who wanted to make an impact through Black Power. Frankie came from St. Lucia. His brother Winston Branch was also in London. He was a young painting student at the Slade and still has a very successful career in St. Lucia in the United States. And, he came from, I think, quite an important family in St. Lucia. So, they had a certain means and certain capacity to present them. It's not a working class background, let's put it like that. And, but nonetheless, I think in this scene from Godard's movie, to me, there's a kind of evident stress in playing out these roles. But there's also something going on in Godard which is to do with multiple voicing, and which is one of Godard's great discovery about who is speaking when, what kind of a voice is being heard, what overlapping voices are being heard. And also, this film is a part of the ambience within which Death May Be Your Santa Claus was made. One has to think of, in that very short space of time, the making of Godard's, let's call it 1+1, seeing it's Godard's, the making of John Boorman's Leo the Last, which involved painting a lot of the Latimer Road area of London black, and then blowing it up at the end, which helped the council a great deal because they could then start rebuilding the Latimer Road area much more quickly, having actually charged to have it blown up by John Boorman. The making of Performance, for example. I think when you see this movie, it's full of things which look crazy now because they come out of a hippie moment. They come out of the moment of violence of Performance. They come out, as I say, of Roeg, of Boorman, of Godard. And it's a kind of fascinating intertext. And again, the question is who can speak in that framework and how can a black subject speak in that framework? So I want to show you a little bit of the... Sorry.
The cats who come out of Italy, Germany, Poland, and France. In the year of generations who speak English perfectly. We have never spoken English perfectly. Never have we spoken English perfectly. Never, never, never.
That is because our people consciously resisted a language that does not belong to them.
That is because our people consciously resisted a language that does not belong to them.
Never did, never will.
Never did and never will.
No matter how they try to run it down our throat, we ain't gonna have it.
No matter how they try to run it down our throat, we ain't never gonna have it.
We ain't gonna have it.
We ain't gonna have it.
You must understand that as a level of resistance.
You must understand this is a level of resistance.
Anybody can speak that simple whitey's language.
Anybody can speak that simple whitey's language.
Anybody can do it.
Anybody can.
Sound of gunfire. Now I'm going to play one other short extract which is important for the film you're about to see. And I've done a previous session on this for Goldsmiths, and I wanted to call it, the title which I was planning to call it was Pulling White Chicks, but we decided to waive that because it seemed even now politically too incorrect. But you'll see that that is one of the themes of Death May Be Your Santa Claus. And it's also one of the themes which was imposed on, if you like, the stereotype of the emergence of black power leaders. And again, is very powerfully present in this extract, the next extract from 1+1. And in saying that, I just again want very quickly to say that think at the time that Fanon was being read by all of us. The Wretched of the Earth and Black
Black-skin, white mask.
Black-skin, white mask were being read by all of us. Those texts, if you like, were worshipped. When Homi Bhabha said years later in his introduction to the book that they'd been ignored, he was completely wrong. They were read all the time, almost to the exclusion of other kinds of texts in some of the circles in which I moved. The other thing which was terribly important was James Baldwin, and the complexities of identity and disidentification that he talks about in Notes of a Native Son in the early essays of arriving in Paris and being a black American in Paris. What is it to be black? What's it to be American? What's to be a black American? What's it to be a black Frenchman facing a black American who doesn't want to be black but wants to be an American? All those complex involutions of Baldwin's working through of what it was to be a writer and who he was in Paris are also, I think, very powerfully present in the background of this film. And it's interesting to think about what Godard did with it. So let's just look at this extract.
There's no such thing as an argument, Chinese show them everything they have. They show them gunpowder. Hey, yo! They said we use festivities. My woman is beautiful. Strong-headed. Hey, that's the man who has one tooth. It's not just the fact that she's a woman that I love. I love her skin. Her soft, smooth, white skin.
So, having set that up, I think that's enough, then, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
I think I just show you the movie and be prepared. It's a funny thing, really, but I think we'll find plenty to talk about it. At the end, David will respond, and we will converse about it, and invite you to converse about it too. And if you wish to bring it back to Roeg, please do. If you don't, please don't. There we are.
And thanks to everybody who's kind of made this possible for me to be here, and thanks, Adrian, for your kind invitation to join you. We've had a couple of conversations about this film, and one of the ways in which you recapitulated on those conversations today was to talk about this question about the articulation of the black subjectivity through the lens of the film. And given that the film had so many layers, both in terms of obviously personal layers in relation to your own involvement, but also in terms of layers in relation to the context in which the film was made, I think I did struggle with the clarity or the focus of the question around black subjectivity, and to kind of have a sense of the ways in which there's an articulation of black subjectivity in that text which belonged to a very particular history. And I had to come at this question particularly in relation to thinking about the history of film and thinking about lens-based media and what lens-based media has made possible and the kinds of discussions that have surrounded it. In particular, of course, a name that has came up in the preamble, the work of Corbina Mercer, who, in a way, is part of a whole series of conversations and discussions which surround this film and surround your engagement with that film. And thinking about Mercer's point about the burden of representation of the black male body, and thinking about that in relation to this film, I had to continue to ask myself, what kind of work, what kind of signifier work are we asking the black male body to do in this text, in this film? What work has been assigned to the body? And in what ways are we then being asked to read that signification? So that was my opening, if you like, in terms of entering the film with these series of questions about the work that the body was being asked to do, the protagonist's role, right from that kind of close cropping of the talking head right at the beginning, all the way through to some of those scenes of the kind of the victimization scene, the victim victimization scene, the master servant scene, the cannibalistic scene, all this is playing out of these tropes. In a way, inviting us to think about the signifying practice as one that is at the same time excessive and yet not quite enough. That was my entry into the film, and that's how I was through the opening moments of the film. But there was a point at which I just thought to myself, this is just not adding up. This kind of framing of how we engage with the film, the work that is at the same time overstated and yet enigmatic, can't be kind of brought together or held within this kind of search to understand a kind of black subjectivity or an articulation of a black subjectivity within that film. So kind of getting stuck, I decided that I'd give up and stop looking for the black subject, stop looking for the black male subject in the film, start looking for an articulation of a black voice in the 60s and in this incredible moment. And as soon as I stopped looking, of course I started to see something. And what I started to see was not the voice or the articulation of a black subject, but actually the voice of an interracial subject. And it was, for me, the subject or subjectivity of the film is the subjectivity of an interracial encounter and a series of interracial encounters. And reading that back through the film and thinking about, okay, the ways in which certain statements were made within the film, I started to rethink them in terms of, actually, they're not statements of blackness, but statements of interracial. So the opening frame with that close cropping of the black man's the talking head as such, it very quickly opens out onto a scene where the talking head is in dialogue with a group of white students. And that group itself is punctuated, and I use the term quite advisedly, is punctuated by the frame, the scene of the black woman in the audience. But the question that's asked, the dialogue that emerges, is constantly one which is put forward as something that's interracial. Equally, the park scene, which gets premised, and I know from some of the conversations which I had even before the film started, you know, the famous park scene, is it still in this film? With that moment of castration, the castration anxiety, and the movement between kind of how the victimization takes place, who's victim and who's not victim. All of that framed in these perhaps kind of usual terms or conventional terms in relation to particular history of lynching and black victimization, actually, again, moves very quickly into this question of an interracial encounter. And if you like, the subject of that victimization is more clearly understood in relation to interraciality than it is in terms of thinking about the black man first being drowned and then the white man being castrated. There's something that's quite mobile there, which I think can only be captured in terms of thinking about interraciality. And that's kind of emphasized by, within that scene, the bracketing of that scene and in the intercutting at one stage of the two scenes of the, I think it's initially a black man with a white woman.
Yes.
No, sorry, it's a black woman with a white man initially, cuddling and kissing. And then latterly, on the other side of the castration scene, there's a black man with a white woman. Yes. So this kind of bracketing and this framing is continually being played out within the film. So that leads us directly into the comments that you're making, Adrian, about the context in which people were reading in relation to, of course, Fanon and Baldwin. And Fanon's point in relation to thinking about blackness as not as a kind of a term that can be independently articulated, but a term that always has to be understood in relation to whiteness. And for me, that statement, which many of us kind of reading Fanon will know, has to be supplemented by another point. This point not just about blackness being understood only in relation to whiteness, but then, of course, the corollary that whiteness is only understood in relation to blackness. So kind of emphasizing that, we kind of add to your pulling white chicks, which I enjoyed immensely, we add to that dating black men.
Yeah.
And if we can think about the film as pulling white chicks dating black men, then we begin to start to think about the articulation of a white woman's desire, a white woman's desire for black men, which gets very clearly articulated in the film, and in a sense allows us to kind of overwrite or overscript some of the ways in which conventionally some of the material that's produced in the 1960s is spoken about in terms of
like
the writing
Flaming
out.
Streets,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. So if we can talk about white female desire for black men and desire featuring as a feature of this interracial subjectivity that is emerging within the film, I think we start to get somewhere that's quite interesting, something that's quite productive. And for me, kind of getting to that point, it's then to ask ourselves, well, what does the articulation of that desire make possible? What does that interracial subject make possible? So with that then, I enter yet again, there's a re-entry point into the historical milieu, thinking about James Baldwin going to Paris in 1948, and going to Paris to see Richard Wright, who himself is only or partly in Paris because of his relationship with a white Jewish woman. And Baldwin feeling that he's able to go to Paris to spend time in this milieu. But it's a milieu which is not just marked by blackness and by this black patriarchal figure, but it's also marked by this series of interracial encounters which are made possible. Equally, thinking about Samuel Delany in The Motion of Light and Water, where he talks in that section about his own his marriage, when he talks about his marriage to Marilyn and going to Michigan, having to go to Michigan, because it's one of the, I think there are only 2 states in the Union at that time that allow, as this troubled term, miscegenation. So if you like, this, of course, that period of work being written from 1960 to 1965, again, if you like, this milieu, this context, is redolent, I think, with this question about the interracial subjectivity. And if I may, I'm just going to read out something from Delany, because I think it's quite useful to help us just focus this point a little bit, finesse the point a bit. And I quote here, he's speaking of himself in the section from the book, The Peripheries of Love. I quote, "You are neither black nor white. You are neither male nor female. And you are that most ambiguous of citizens, the writer." There was something at once very satisfying and very sad placing myself at this pivotal suspension. It seemed, in the Park of Dawn, a kind of centre formed of a play of ambiguities from which I might move in any direction. A play of ambiguities. For me, I think that what's interesting in relation to Delany's take on this is that, if you like, the double negation that is made possible by talking about being neither black nor white leads then to him talking about ambiguity and allowing him to speak about ambiguity. And ambiguity is a space that allows him to do things, that allows him to be, allows him to find a different practice or strategy of self-subjectification. What's interesting for me to contrast that with Death May Be Your Santa Claus is that it seems to me that we're not looking at a double negation leading to an ambiguity, we're actually looking at a double affirmation. You are black and you are white. And for me, what was interesting in that is this, it seemed to me quite a vociferous articulation of whiteness. And here we are, of course, on the ground of Richard Dyer. But if we go back to the crowd scene, where he's standing on the figure standing on the soapbox, and the jeering at it, there's a number of moments in which there's a collective articulation of whiteness. We, the white people, gave you the buses. We, the white people, did this, or we didn't, and we didn't do that. And I think that kind of articulation of a voice of whiteness is something that I think we need to kind of hold on to and think about and see where we can take that. Particularly, I mean, I'm reading, I just have been rereading Andrea Levy's book, Small Island, in which this, if you like, this moment that we're talking about, in this interracial moment, is prefigured in a moment of a post-war moment, again in the 1940s. So in a way, this kind of double affirmation for me within Death May Be Your Santa Claus produces something that's much, again, which is playful and excessive, but actually something that I started to think about in a different term, which was in this term of jubilation, which again is characterised in those final scenes where the two figures kind of run off dancing together. Not the final scene, but one of the later scenes. Sorry, it's not the final scene. So, if you like, where I'm left is what we do with this double affirmation of whiteness and blackness, a clear articulation of white female desire, of black male desire, of white male desire, of black female desire, where what happens when we actually begin to assert that those articulations of those desires, and how can we begin to find the language to frame that? And of course, it has to be a language outside of the kinds of tropes that already exist, already circulating. We're thinking about was Paul McCartney, that ebony and ivory thing? I'm not sure if anybody remembers that. I don't know if anybody also has this memory, which is from the 70s. I'm sure it's from the 70s because I've got those colours in my head. Where the ink is white, the page is black, or the page is white, the ink is black. And do people remember that tune? I don't know if people are laughing embarrassingly. But this kind of sense in which how does one kind of begin to articulate that in a way which is meaningful and fun, but actually does some work, has some work to do. So going back to that moment brings me right up to date, and this is where I'll start to end, because I think I've said quite a lot, or I've said enough. But I want to kind of bring us back to how we sit next to Paul Gilroy's notion of conviviality, which I think has some kind of resonances with some of the work that you participated in. But for some reason, I'm thinking that the work of jubilation, or I even want to use the term jubilee, actually, partly to reference or cross-reference Dymon, but also in terms of what was missing from Dymon, which I think we find somewhere in Death May Be Your Santa Claus, which is this dealing with or handling or relationship to kind of the racial issues of race and interraciality. But also within that, being able to return to these questions with questions of memory and desire, and of course the excesses of that. So that kind of that sense of insanity, that sense of hysteria, that sense of the term the man needs a woman to drive him insane. All of that, I think, is there within this film, and I think that would be my starting point. I think for us to continue our discussion, Adrian, on this.
Yes, I know. I think that's wonderful, actually. It's definitely. I think that the idea of the double affirmation is interesting, and in a way I want to say that think about starting out ironically from this notion of pulling white chicks, that double affirmation itself becomes the inner voice of somebody in conflict. But it's a conflict affirmed as a kind of jubilation.
Yeah.
So I think what you said is very interesting there, and I think it's very important. If one wanted to take this in terms of where... See, one thing that interests me a lot now, and this is just simply something to do with being at the end of one's career and older, is how interesting it is to come across these things which were done before they were possible to be thought about, although they were thought about thoroughly in their own terms. I mean, there was no Homi Bhabha, there was nothing really. I mean, if you like, the notion of what we might now call post-colonial theory is the beginning of race and class, and Sivandanan in London, the beginning of Rashid Arain's early work in London and so on. But there isn't a theoretical framework for thinking about these things, and people are not in a way thinking theoretically out of something which is developed with the tools you've been using now. So the question then becomes of what one is doing with Baldwin, and Baldwin is, in a way, you can say that the relationship, this is why I see a kind of queer relationship to a book of Baldwin's like Giovanni's Room.
Yeah.
It's precisely that Giovanni's Room is an affirmation of whiteness.
Yes, it is.
But at the same time, it's one which a black man makes as a sublimation of the question of homosexuality, and his relationship with Richard Wright and being in Paris, and so on and so on. So there's a parallel there too. I'm trying to think about Delaney at that moment, because obviously The Motion of Light on Water, which is Delaney's memoirs of, 1990, I don't know, 1999, 98, something like that. He's thinking through things, through queer theory, through a kind of fully developed queer theory, as well as his own Marxism. He's in conversation with De Lauretis and so on. And at that time, if you look at Delaney's science fictions of that time, again, there's this affirmation of the polymorphous.
Exactly.
That people are beyond gender. You know, the whole point about space is that it's beyond everything.
Yeah.
So space fiction is the projection of a kind of endless polymorphousness of the body, and the body is strange from itself with the three-dimensional tattoos and all those things that Delaney does. So in a way, I think that this dialectic you've opened up is one of the adequacy of a moment to its self-description and the adequacy of subsequent descriptions to realizing, if you like, that, I'm going to borrow your word again now, the conviviality of that moment. And that's getting complicated, but it's, you see, for me, so much of that is kind of, achieves a kind of documentary status almost. You know, the fact they're skipping through the park in slow motion. You could do that then, you know, because those when you smoked far too much dope listening to the Incredible String Band, you believed all kinds of things were possible, you know. So there is that kind, and then there's the affirmation of whiteness that you call it in the discussion at Hyde Park Corner, and it's true there's a documentary thing there because all those gestures, the turning away, the turning, they're not London gestures now, I think. I don't want to be nostalgic about that or sentimental, but it's something which catches a moment which looks like acting and isn't acting. And that, again, becomes something one might fantasize about. I'm not sure what to make of that. But when I watched the film again, what was it, about 4 years ago, after not having seen it for, getting on for, how many years, it is 40, 35, whatever it was. It's 37 years. It was very odd to see how complete it was as something, as manifestations like which was possible in London then. And how all the weirdnesses of it and the embarrassments of it are a result of one not being in position to think through how embarrassing it is. You see, does that make a kind of
sense?
sense?
It does, because, I mean, the thing in terms of, I'm going to kind of just kind of pull it back with the nostalgia, kind of the nostalgic drive, because of course, you know, nostalgia is kind of often kind of underused or under-examined. And that kind of point that you're making about the adequacy of the moment to itself, and then saying the adequacy of the kinds of theoretical tools which can help us understand that moment. Again, let's affirm both. Let's kind of take us to the adequacy of the moment to itself, and think about the ways in which the context in which you're reading, thinking, talking, working with people is generating the kinds of material that will then later allow us to think other matters through. Can you kind of take us to that moment, to talk us through the kinds of responses to Baldwin, for instance, responses to Fanon? I mean, how are these handled amongst the people you're working with, making films with, playing with?
Yes, can I just drop something else in first? I think it's interesting, is when you look at one of the things which I'm reading from, which is the Lao Tzu and Tao Te Ching, is don't forget those are also being read in a different context, which is that, say, Cornelius Cardew's concerts, and John Cage's A Year from Monday, and John Cage's Indeterminacy. So none of those texts belong to one cultural frame at that point. And again, I find that's very interesting. One reason why, in view of Grant and my having done that work on car during the 2 exhibitions, I thought it was interesting to bring that back to something where we'd already thought about that with a completely different way of visualizing it, in a framework which takes it into that extraordinary scene with the second hand, which for me knocks spots off of Jarman's Jubilee. It's much queerer than Jarman, actually. Jarman is so artificially queer. And that really is, that's the kind of real thing, because it's straight in a way. And so what do I think? What do I think about that without being too personal? Fanon, for me, those books like Fanon, because I was just an art history PhD student, so while one was making that film, I was reading hundreds of articles during the day, boring articles actually, all day in the Victoria and Albert Library. So you have all these different lives which are very hard to imagine, how I never had time for anything in the end. And what I think about Fanon, I think of it in terms of spaces. I think it in terms of where you saw the book, on whose bedside table you saw the book, in which bookshop you first found it. I mean, I first found Fanon in Joie de Lire, which was the great left-wing Paris bookshop in 1967 or 68. And this is a bookshop you went to because it was a kind of shelter, it was a place of conviviality, and there were these books by people one hadn't heard of, by people called Fanon. Baldwin, I mean, personally I came across just by chance, by being given a copy of Giovanni's Room when I was a teenager, and then thinking this is important, and then reading him continuously after that. But I think in the circles in which we made that film, there was an assumption that because we'd read those things, we knew what we were doing, but we didn't necessarily discuss them.
Okay.
And it was rather after making that film, 3 years later, when I bumped into Frankie Dymon for the last time I ever saw him in Paris, that I realized how much he was a part of those post-Baldwinian circles, that he was sitting in a cafe with Ted Jones and a load of other important American black writers and artists, and I sat down with them, and it's kind of gobsmacking, really. It's like suddenly someone you've known very closely is sitting with a group of myths.
Yeah.
And you just fiddle with your coffee and listen. And so I think that what is important about what you're saying now is that you are able to rescue that from common sense in a very real Gramscian way. Our relationship to Baldwin and Fanon was one of common sense, I think. And that was why when Homi Bhabha wrote that introduction to his edition, said that it wasn't read enough, I couldn't believe it. But of course, in a sense, in his own terms, he's right that it wasn't read enough because it wasn't read in a way that subsequently became possible.
Sure.
And what did we think about those things? I don't know. So I think there's, for me, if you like, this is one of the things about making these histories now, which is I wanted to take the Rui Rosenbach thing back to then, if you like, is to kind of, if you like, have a kind of imagery, an image bank, an iconography, or whatever you want to call it, of the possibilities of articulating histories and re-articulating them so they have a currency now without talking about the relevance of the past. It's bringing back the currency of an affect in a new framework and a new language. And that seems to me to be very much what you've done with your opening discussion there. And if one wants to take it back to the Rosen film, in a sense, he tries to do that in the present time by introducing the SN sexual scenario as a double voicing of an affirmation and a disaffirmation. As an affirmation of a pleasure at the same time as a disaffirmation, which is an exorcism. And I don't think any of that's going on here. This isn't critical in that kind of way.
No, apart from
at
perhaps
all.
Well, in terms of responding to affect or kind of working with affect, apart from, of course, the very difficult castration scene, I mean, that's the only thing that...
And I took that as comedy.
Completely, really?
I was taking
don't know
it
if that's
back.
a way out.
Well, because of what you're saying, because of that interraciality.
Sure.
They go and throw him in, you're just getting very outraged. It's only 10 years after Notting Hill, and isn't this disgusting? And this is really an affirmation of Then the guy gets out and
Yeah.
plays the ape and castrates the white guy. And you think, gosh, that's really funny.
Yeah.
Because it releases you from a whole set of stereotypes.
Yes. But there's a similar kind of fun in Rosen as well. I mean, just because it's funny doesn't mean that
I think he's hilarious.
Things like that. Well, there's one thing I did want to bring back, not in terms of trying to historicise too much our discussion, but just in terms of thinking about Lao Tzu and these texts which were kind of read anywhere, in a sense. Well, they were kind of particularly read in terms of thinking about a metropolitan culture, or the metropolitan culture which you were part of, which you were producing. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because one of the kind of touchstones for this debate, for me, is in relation to Chinua Achebe's discussion about blackness as a metropolitan phenomenon, and thinking about blackness, which of course relates back to Fanon as well in terms of some encounter, but actually talking about it as something that's metropolitan, and that as him as an African writer, talking about the ways in which his own subjectivity articulates itself in several layers. It's layers as an Igbo person, an Igbo man, as an African, but also as a black man, but as a black man in relation to particular metropolitan settings. And I'm wondering whether there's something about the metropolis of London in the 1960s that allows someone like Frankie to make these kinds of statements, to do these kinds of gestures, that there's a kind of, whether it's to do with a network of people who are thinking or a network of people who are willing to participate, there's something about that space that enables a kind of articulation of that kind of blackness which wouldn't be possible perhaps elsewhere, perhaps even elsewhere in England than elsewhere in the world.
Yeah. I would say yes. I'm sorry, it's a kind of dull answer. Yes. As I said, when you think that in the evenings when this film isn't being made, at the Arts Lab you have Madala doing his early performances. I don't think Madala's that important then, but he was, and you can see records of him in the archive that Angelica Sagar has, her father's filmmaking. There's footage of the Arts Lab and so on. And I think that's also, although it's a different kind of, I would say in a way the Arts Lab isn't as far into this multiple affirmation as Frankie's film is. Yeah. So in some sense you can cross a text between them. And a more interesting parallel might be to think about what Paul Overy and I'm sorry, Thingamy isn't here tonight. I've forgotten his name. The guy who's written on who's at Essex, who wrote on Oiticica in the Oiticica in London book. It might be interesting to look at the way in which Guy Brett and Paul were writing about Oiticica then, and how you could handle the whole question of Tropicalia and queerness, and that in the context of London, and in context of the Arts Lab and so on, where Oiticica was moving around. And how one then thinks about Oiticica when he was recuperated for a huge exhibition at the Tate a few years ago, and his whole family turned up from Brazil to say, we're not talking about his sexuality, because he wasn't. No. And, and try to set ground rules. So then you see backwards and forwards culture clashes, if you like. Yeah. And I think that might be, what in a way I wanted to do by showing this film here was to say this film is a part of that archive. And if you want to go through the Oiticica stuff in London material again, then this should be there too. So it's a matter of doing what historians do, in a kind of very straightforward, dull historical way, which is to find bits of the archive which we didn't know about, and say, let them have an effect on us, and how we've theorized on other things, so that history becomes more of a loop, or in Deleuzean terms, it becomes much more folded. Yes. So I think in a sense, Frankie's film is a bit of a fold which we are in, but we've never gone right into. Does that make a a better sense of it? Yeah, so I don't think there's a rule for that. But do we want to see if any of our poor audience, as I always call them, our poor audience, have anything they'd like to say?
Hi, David.
Hello there.
Hello. A far cry from Thomas Becket, I think, but there we go. Welcome. I think you're wrong.
Good.
Because You were talking about the. Don't get me wrong. I agree with there was a double affirmation thing going on, definitely. However, there was also a double articulation, which I'm looking at the moment in what I'm doing. But the black voice on the podium was articulate and educated, whatever that means, well-read, whatever that means. And the collective white voice that you pointed out, that you alluded to, that you pointed out about, was actually very, very uneducated. It was collective, and so sounded stronger, but in fact was actually not backed up with very much of anything. And what happened was there was another black man in the crowd that actually pointed to some other. So that actually joined in that collective black voice that was actually articulate about the reason why we're over here is because you came to our countries first and took all our things and brought them over here. But that sort of almost sort of I would think it makes me think of Edward Said, actually, that whole Orientalism and all of that. But really, just that kind of the fact that I feel that it was a double articulation rather than that. That's the comment I wanted to make.
Okay. Should I come back?
No, let's take two or three comments and.
Thank you for that.
So there's at the back, two on that row actually. I'm sorry, there's that.
Three points which were not connected in any shape or form. The first one is to try to, I want to reinsert Homi in a slightly different way. Maybe that's just generational, I don't know. And I think what I think Homi is getting at is that if you were reading humanities at that time, you wouldn't come across Fanon on the reading list. And I think it's one way of grappling that would be to suggest a possible reading list. That would be quite exciting. One would be to read together Fanon, Foucault, and Benjamin, and enjoy the frisson that follows from that, or to read Fanon, Freud, and Lacan, and also enjoy the frisson that comes from two of those things. And following that reading, come back to this film. And perhaps adding on to that, have a look at Martina Atley's observation of the footnote of Cappuccino in Fanon's work, in order to kind of address the sexuation of the 60s, as it were. That's a first remark. The second remark I want to make is perhaps what you just remarked on. I mean, Ben Bosanquet, who is the character who's in the mass crowd, be interesting if we're alive to look at that film and think about the remark about the black guy in the mass crowd. Their reference to Nkrumah, and I don't think that reference to Nkrumah is as innocent as it makes, but it registers something else, which leads me to think about now the interesting thing now is not so much is the question about a different humanism. A humanism that enables us to look into the face of the other as incomplete subjects. Now, my father was of a generation of Syritza Kama. In fact, was a friend of Syritza Kama. Him and Syritza Kama, Ruth, my father and my stepmother lived in London, where at that particular period of time, and it was kind of forbidden. And I was at high school in another place, and some of the material they were sending me had very much to do with the kind of stuff they would encounter in the public spaces in London. And I can almost imagine my father's bedroom then being identical to the film scene that you describe. And the kind of music, I listened to Deep Purple at the time, and I listened to Deep Purple, especially Child in Time, as a kind of prefiguring of that stuff. So the point I'm trying to make, on one hand, is the kind of soundtrack of the 60s, and the way 68 is an overseas story that comes back into the center to register itself as the forbidden. So I think it's a fantastic film, thank you very much, but I do think the kind of suggestions that it makes for me are better improved by a kind of earlier reading list I suggested at the beginning.
Can we take and then, is that okay, David? We'll just take three and then
I think both of my references are because it's before my time generation. So please, if you mentioned it, I apologize for repeating. I'm interested in the history of the song, the title of the song, and the film, and then how the park scene was received. Because, I mean, I've seen a lot of movies in my life, but I had a very strong visceral reaction. I've never seen anything like that, and I've seen a lot of. That was just shocking. I don't know. For me, I've seen a lot. How was it received when it first came out?
Well, I do you know, I had no idea. I mean, I say I've been doing a lot of work around this period recently, and what I realize is that the closer one is to things, the less one knows about them. Because one thing we did very well in the late 60s, in a way, was to live in the moment. Even if you were hiding from something, it gave you the fervor to live in the moment. You know, I was arguing a while ago with Jonathan Katz about his sexual utopianism, about the kind of pre-liberation period, and I was saying, actually, it was hell. You spent all your time sublimating, but that gave you an immense capacity to live in the moment, or in different moments. So I remember people being shocked by it, and I was a bit taken aback by it when I finally saw it. But apparently, you say that it was banned after that, but we have here someone who is close to Mott the Hoople and might like to comment on the question of the song. But shall we take that now, or shall we go back to the other questions that were?
Perhaps take the question of the song, because it's second hand, isn't it?
Yes, second hand. And
would you like to say something about?
I don't know much about second hand, but I know that Guy Stevens.
So could you just wait until the microphone comes, because this is recorded actually.
Yeah. I knew of second hand and the album, but Guy Stevens, who was a very famous producer in the late 60s, the early 70s at Ireland, took the title of the film and gave it to Mott for a song. He stole it, and I was going to ask who devised the title for the film.
It was Frankie, actually.
Okay.
Yes, I never was quite sure why he devised it, but he certainly was very definite and insistent about it. And
No reason given.
No reason given. I think, in a way, it becomes evident from that it adds, if you like, a note of pessimism to something which is affirmative. So then you can put an emphasis on any level. Death may be your Santa Claus. Death may be your Santa Claus. Death may be your Santa Claus. You know, we don't know, because there isn't, if you like, an instance of death in it. There are many instances of people receding into total fantasy, which might be a kind of death, or it may be that, you know, I don't know. I think about the Godardianism of the film, the extent to which, you know, the amount of Godard in it is, you know, actually taking Godard and saying, I want it back. That's why I want you to see that scene of Frankie in the Godard at the beginning, because the extent to which he and Clive Tickner actually want to take that back and do something else with it and resituate it in a different cultural framework. You might come back to the point you were making, is a kind of anti-68ism almost, although the hero says, you know, the French Revolution was completed in 68. It's not Godard's 68 that Frankie wants, because all those cuts between the country and the woodland, which are characteristic of Sympathy 1+1, violent cuts between different forms of noise and so on, are things which, the sex scenes, you know, the sex scenes are clearly based on Vivre sa vie or Weekend. So there's a kind of intentional saturation which, again, what I was trying to think of as a kind of inner voice of how do you appropriate, how do you be a subject when you yourself have been, in a way, figured like that Godard film, and how do you take back that figuring as your own articulation? So I think all those questions come back to the Death May Be Your Santa Claus as a title, but it can remain an enigma, I think. I mean, one of the things I like about the film now is that it doesn't have an argument. There is no argument, you know, it really is a piece of paradoxis. It dumps one thing after another, and some of them relate to each other, and some of them don't, and it trusts the audience, actually. It really... But again, come back, so just on the question of violence. Do you all recall the bit in performance where James Fox is gun whipped. You must all recall that. I think I just want very vulgarly to say it has a comparable beauty to the castration scene.
I'm
sorry to put it like that.
I'm going to bring us back. Thank you for that. But I don't want to lose some of the other points that were made, which do need to be.
No, you must take them up.
do need to be deserve some kind of response. And first, the point about if I get you correctly, George, in terms of talking about the 1960s as this overseas story that comes back to the centre. And I don't know if you're deliberately paraphrasing the Salman Rushdie point about the British not knowing their history because so much of it took place overseas. And whether there's a question about how we start to rethink, or there's an invitation to rethink the geopolitics of this moment as something that's kind of disruptive because of a kind of a figuring of disruption taking place elsewhere. I think that's, if I get you correctly, then...
That's really better put than I was trying to say. Where I want to suggest that 68, there are a number of moments of empire return. Say moment of break, moment of fall. And I want to think of 68 in exactly the same way. And what we're saying there is the kind of encounter's return coming to play havoc or transruptive in the here. Eh? And I think our reading of 68 literally turns on its head if you read it as the empire coming here.
Yes.
And outside of it, you wouldn't encounter, interracial sex becomes an interesting point of reference because of that return of the other into the center, the face of blackness in that way. Yeah. So it has those questions wanting to be sutured properly.
Yeah. Can I add a little to that also? I think we should agree with this. Is direct response is that if you say take I think an unbelievably important piece of writing, which is C.L.R. James's letters to his home newspaper, which he wrote in London when he first came in 29, I think. All those tensions are present and exquisitely recorded. There's this thing of being on a crowded central line at City and flirting with the secretaries who've never flirted with the black guy. There's an extraordinary, but he takes it from England and sends it back. So it comes back to what you're saying, that all the history happened overseas, but what can be recorded, the affects which you can record in James' experience, he then sends back to his own country. So again, they don't appear here until years later when those, those letters to the newspaper are edited in England.
In the collection.
So sort of terribly long, I agree with you in that, there are terribly long timescales of displacement of where we can sense those things and affects, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, there was just one other point that you made, because you did quantity make three points, and that was the point about the different humanism, and you talked about you made a reference, I think, to your parents or to friends living in London, and this point about looking into the face of the other as incomplete, and the other as incomplete, which is, I guess, one side, if you like, of the Fanonian coin. But I would invite you to also to think about the other side of that coin, which also comes out of some of this reading, which is kind of then also looking at the face of the other as something that is more than complete, that is hyperbolic in a sense, which again, I think hyperbole being a kind of modality of Death May Be Your Santa Claus completely. Okay, I don't want to be too complete in responding to all these things, but then there was just the final point that this lady made about the double articulation and the white being not articulate as against the black man and so. I don't know about your reading, Adrian, but in my terms, I would just finesse the point that I was making. I wasn't making it just in relation to that scene. I was actually talking about the voice within the film. So in a sense, I was trying to talk about the ways in which kind of voices, if you like, could be positioned as white voices or black voices within the film as a whole. And even in the notes which were written in relation to your own voiceover, there's this talk about you being these Oxford-educated this Oxford-educated voiceover, and of course it's a white Oxford-educated.
It's not Stuart Hall, that's for certain.
So in those terms, I was thinking about it a bit more openly than just that scene. That's okay.
Yeah, there's something I could add completely anecdotally to that, which you all might think is quite immoral at this stage, and it's slightly hagiographical in relation to someone in our circles we know very well, who thank God is not here. But it would be around about 1981 or 82, and I was teaching at Portsmouth Poly, and in those days, again, you know, the staff and students had big parties, and everyone stayed up late in people's gardens and talked, and I was standing in one of these gardens in the summer talking to someone, and I heard a conversation from behind a hedge, and someone was talking, and I thought this was one of the most educated Marxist utterances I'd ever heard. Now, but in a way that we hadn't learned from endlessly arguing over Gramsci or Fanon or Althusser or whatever. It was a voice, a very young voice, and it spoke with a lot of experience, and it was a beautiful political discussion. And I couldn't listen to my conversation because I was so taken with that one. I realized it was a student, but it was someone who'd come from a profound Marxist culture, which wasn't mine and was much profounder. And I said to the person I was talking to, who the hell is that? And he said, oh, that's John Acumfra, he's an undergraduate, you must come and meet him. And that was how I met Acumfra. But it was an experience I couldn't conceivably have had of Marxism. So you put that alongside, you know, I'm sorry to make it that personal, but I think it comes back to precisely the points we're making and the points in that film. So I think there's a way in which, again, you can say the anecdotal enables, if you like, a flash of refiguration of something which is historical and archival, or enables one, and in that sense, I want to continue to say, you know, that how this film works is an enigma of kinds, and it's probably going to stay an enigma because we can do all those explanations, but it's puzzling. And so that thing of never quite having one's own history, and what way this film then holds a certain history of England in its hands, I think is quite an interesting one. Yeah. Do you want to say any more about that, David?
That's fine. I think that's
Francis. Marguerite, were you going to say something? Okay. Say something.
I can't say very much because theoretically speaking I can't keep up with all this, but as somebody who was there then and is here now, it seems to me there's a kind of absence of fear in the film, that things can't be said or that there are boundaries which are invisible which you'll fall over, as if all that kind of massive structure of division had not been put properly in place, but it wasn't absent, but it wasn't there either. And I remember that too, of that time. It was possible to respond and to be in that moment. And I think the film does show that, because looking at it in not so much the present context, but maybe of about 8 or 10 years ago, it could have be accused of being unacceptable because of the castration, because of the there's a working class people in that part in the Hyde Park Corner scene. It isn't just difference from the point of view of black and white, actual class, because the guy speaking is clearly a middle class speaker, and those are working class, largely men, making very working class of that period gestures.
2 years
rhetorical.
after the dock strike.
Yes, 2 years after the... But the absence of fear in that scene is completely fascinating, because people are quite good-humouredly indulging in quite sort of almost not their own racism, voicing something which is there, but not necessarily belonging to them as such. So they're quite cheerful about it. And the guy listening to it takes it on, and there's all sorts of... So that really fascinated me as an experience of looking back. That's all, really.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that in a way that means a kind of counterpart to the play the violence, the real violence, which some people find shocking, the catch-up scene, as I call it, having an element of play in it as well, because it's not that the film is denying the reality of racism, the reality of violence or sexual violence or gay harassment, or, it's not denying those things at all, but it's displacing them onto a kind of light-footed apperception, if you like. That's what I would call it. And that doesn't stop one from feeling things, but it gives one a frame for recognizing the value of the abject and the value of the function, the meaning of the value of the abject and the horribleness of real violence, if you like, real violence. And in some ways, I think that's as politically effective as maybe as politically effective in the context and the conjuncture as anger. In fact, in a sense, it doesn't limit you in the same way that anger does, even though it doesn't motivate you in the same way as anger. And I find that interesting about the movie, and the fun of making it, actually, because no one was in ontological crises. What, oh my God, this is the violent scene, and we've got to. It was kind of like it really was a party. And the Bentley, I was explaining to other people, the first thing Frankie did when he got the money for the film was to hire an immense Bentley, and big enough to pile all the crew in, and all the hangers on and voice parts, and so there's 2 weeks riding around London in a Bentley. It was causing immense class aggression, because you stopped in working class streets, people cheering and booing. And so it was, God knows what. I'm sure more money was spent on the Bentley than on the stock, actually. But in the end, but it was still a very serious project. And so I think that that thing about not being frightened of things is something to conserve as a historical affect and wonder what it would mean now. Because it's not that life was better then than now, but the forms of regulation and control, as we know from everything we've studied in Foucault and people, are not what we thought they were. And so I think it may give an access to a kind of,
Just a really small act. At our peril, we underestimate how race is not teleologically driven by hate and anger.
No, absolutely.
And so on. Actually, it's driven by desire. Yeah? And I think one of the wonderful things precisely about the work is how the play of desire drives racialization then. Yeah? And it's because of that allure, that the frisson I described earlier, that you can only intervene or make sense of it precisely on the kind of regulation of pleasure, yeah? The ways in which the different kinds of pleasures in between are taking place.
Yes.
And that's what I find very exciting about how we record in the archive the articulation of race. Yeah?
Yes.
So I don't think of it as sort of not necessarily theorized in the way in which one does theory.
No.
I don't do that theory either. But I do think it does offer us sort of, it's not an absolute beginning, but it offers us a way of breaking into making sense of how the story of desire sutures, if you like, what is going on in that moment, in that moment conjuncturally.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, actually, completely. Sorry, this...
I was just going to say, I guess in between these 2 points is just finishing graduate school, not understanding the historical context, but you're actually just, the Kobina Mercer's essay, Skinhead Sex thing, that kind of desire triangle reference. In terms of Mapplethorpe's work, you're saying the exact same thing, it's that desire. So I guess, that's the way I only can understand that film in terms of theoretical. It could never seem real, it didn't seem real at all, but it's just interesting contextually how she can experience it.
I lived through that period.
Yeah, no. Oh no, both of you. It's just very interesting because to me, you, as a 29-year-old, you just apply theory to that. It doesn't have that resonance of, I don't know, maybe it's...
The Goldsmith students were terribly interested in where you, some of them anyway, enough to voice it, were very interested in where you get the orange underpants. But you know, that's art students, and they were from a shop on Notting Hill, which has long since gone.
Sadly.
But we all had them.
So ask if you still got them.
Say no more. Say no more. Yes.
Let's save that for later. Any more?
Five
more.
people. Oh, no, we can stop now. Actually, that's fine. I could just thank David very much indeed for a wonderful, wonderful intervention, and thank you all for coming to the last session of this series. And thank Iniva again, especially Nada and the technical staff for the immense work they've done in supporting us. Tessa Jackson, the director, and Grant, the senior curator, he's senior curator, I forget his titles now, and Hila Peleg for curating the exhibition, and Rui for not objecting. Anyway, thanks to everyone very much.